At the heart of New York City, the United Nations headquarters once again became the stage for global diplomacy. On September 24, 2025, French President Emmanuel Macron and Iranian President Massoud Pezeshkian held a meeting that, at first glance, seemed like routine statesmanship. But beneath the formal greetings and polite handshakes lay a story of nuclear tension, looming sanctions, and the delicate balance between confrontation and dialogue. This meeting did not happen in isolation. It came against the backdrop of years of mistrust and fragile negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. Since the collapse of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the landmark deal meant to limit Iran's nuclear ambitions in exchange for sanctions relief, the Islamic Republic has been under growing pressure from the West. The United States' withdrawal from the accord in 2018 under President Donald Trump set off a chain reaction of escalations. Now, with the clock ticking down to the automatic reinstatement of United Nations sanctions, the stakes could not be higher. President Macron, a leader who has often cast himself as Europe's mediator in global crises, entered this meeting with a clear but daunting mission to prevent total diplomatic breakdown. France has historically balanced pressure with engagement when dealing with Tehran, and Macron is determined to preserve that tradition. He knows that for Europe, the collapse of talks would mean more than just another Middle Eastern setback. It would risk driving Iran deeper into the orbit of Russia and China, accelerating the division of the world into rival blocs. President Massoud Pezeshkian, meanwhile, arrived at the United Nations with his own message. Representing a country under crippling sanctions, facing economic hardship and political isolation, he has positioned himself as both a voice of resistance and a messenger of peace. In his earlier UN address, Pezeshkian vowed that Iran would never seek nuclear weapons, condemned aggression in Gaza, and called for regional cooperation. But convincing the world of his sincerity and shifting Western skepticism remains a monumental challenge. The handshake between Macron and Pezeshkian may have lasted only seconds, but its symbolism cannot be overstated. It was a visual signal to the world that dialogue, however strained, remains possible. Diplomacy thrives on such images, leaders standing together, even when words exchanged behind closed doors remain guarded or undisclosed. To many, this was Macron's last attempt to salvage a crumbling process before sanctions inevitably return. To others, it was Iran's bid to show that it is not completely isolated on the world stage. The larger question is, what happens if diplomacy fails? 4 days from now, if no progress is achieved, UN sanctions will automatically snap back into place. That would further restrict Iran's economy, cut off European trade opportunities, and raise the risk of regional escalation. Oil markets could tighten, global energy prices could spike, and the fragile Middle Eastern security balance could tip into new instability. For Macron, failure would not only mark a diplomatic setback, but also a blow to Europe's credibility in international mediation. The context is broader than nuclear talks alone. The Middle East today is more volatile than it has been in years. Gaza remains under blockade, with thousands of civilian deaths fueling anger across the region. Conflicts in Syria and Yemen remain unresolved, while the rivalry between Iran and Israel intensifies. Against this backdrop, Europe fears that further isolating Iran will only fuel more aggressive policies from Tehran and embolden hardliners. Macron's gamble, therefore, is to keep the door to dialogue open, even if breakthroughs remain elusive. Iran's strategy is equally complex. By meeting with Macron, Pezeshkian is signalling that Tehran values engagement with Europe, even if trust is thin. Iran understands that France cannot single-handedly lift sanctions, but Paris does carry weight within the European Union. More importantly, Macron's role as a global mediator gives Iran a chance to drive a wedge between Europe's approach and Washington's harder stance. Tehran's calculation is simple. If Europe resists aligning fully with the US, Iran gains breathing space. But Macron faces obstacles not just abroad, but also at home. Within Europe, leaders are divided. Germany and others support continued talks, while some nations quietly lean toward Washington's tougher line. This disunity undermines European leverage. By meeting Pezeshkian directly, Macron attempts to assert French leadership on the global stage. But his critics argue that without unified European backing, his efforts risk falling flat. Still, Macron has built his political brand on taking risks in diplomacy, whether with Russia, China, or now Iran. For Pezeshkian, the domestic pressure is immense. Ordinary Iranians suffer under inflation, shortages, and the daily weight of sanctions. Every move on the diplomatic front is closely watched at home, where citizens question whether engagement with the West brings relief or merely prolongs suffering. By standing beside Macron at the UN, Pezeshkian projects an image of legitimacy and global recognition, crucial for a leader who must balance foreign policy defiance with domestic expectations of economic stability. The meeting's significance also lies in what it prevents rather than what it achieves. Even if no agreement emerges, the act of meeting delays total collapse. It buys time, and in diplomacy, time itself is often the most valuable commodity. Macron and Pezeshkian are not expected to draft a new treaty in a single conversation. But their encounter is a reminder that even in the tensest moments, there remains space for dialogue. The symbolism of location also matters. To meet inside the UN headquarters, a building designed to embody multilateralism and global cooperation, is a reminder of the stakes involved. The United Nations has struggled in recent years to maintain its role as a forum for peace in an increasingly fractured world. By hosting this encounter, the UN once again becomes the stage where nations, however divided, still come together under one roof to attempt dialogue. History shows us that diplomacy often moves in small steps, not giant leaps. Handshakes, photographs, and carefully worded communiques may appear superficial, yet they shape perceptions and lay groundwork for future possibilities. When US President Richard Nixon first traveled to China in 1972, it began with carefully staged gestures before breakthroughs came. Macron's meeting with Pezeshkian could be viewed in the same light, a small but meaningful gesture that keeps possibilities alive. Still, the risks of failure remain enormous. If sanctions return, Iran's economy will tighten further. Ordinary citizens will bear the brunt, potentially fueling unrest inside the country. Regionally, Iran could respond with escalation, increasing its support for proxy groups, expanding its military footprint, or even accelerating nuclear activities in defiance of Western demands. Such a scenario would increase the likelihood of confrontation with Israel, the United States, and Gulf states. For Europe, this is precisely the nightmare Macron hopes to avoid. The broader geopolitical landscape cannot be ignored. Iran has increasingly turned eastward, strengthening ties with Russia and China, particularly through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. If Europe disengages, this pivot will accelerate, creating a more polarized world. Macron's move is therefore not only about Iran's nuclear program, but also about preventing the global order from splitting further into rigid rival blocs. By engaging Pezeshkian, he is betting on the power of dialogue to slow that drift. The handshake between Macron and Pezeshkian will circulate widely across news platforms and social media. Supporters will frame it as a sign of pragmatic diplomacy. Critics will dismiss it as empty symbolism, mere theatre in the face of hard realities. Yet history reminds us that even symbolic acts matter. They signal intentions, open doors, and keep channels alive at moments when total silence could be disastrous. As the world counts down the 4 remaining days before UN sanctions snap back, the meeting between Macron and Pezeshkian will be remembered less for what was said behind closed doors and more for what it represented. 2 leaders, standing in one of the world's most visible diplomatic arenas, acknowledged that confrontation is not inevitable. The outcome remains uncertain. The sanctions may still return, talks may still collapse, but the fact that Emmanuel Macron and Massoud Pezeshkian chose to meet, to look each other in the eye, and to exchange words rather than threats is itself a story worth telling. In the corridors of the United Nations, diplomacy is often reduced to moments like this: a handshake, a photograph, a symbolic act. And yet, these moments carry weight. They remind us that amid the rhetoric of war, sanctions, and confrontation, leaders can still choose dialogue. On September 24, 2025, Emmanuel Macron and Massoud Pezeshkian chose precisely that. Whether their meeting changes the course of history remains to be seen, But in an era when trust is scarce and tensions run high, even a brief encounter between adversaries can serve as a fragile reminder that diplomacy is not yet dead.
Parfait.
Thank you.
Merci, Président.
Thank you.
Merci à vous. Je vous en prie.